Thank you so much for inviting me down. It's great to connect with people in this neck of the woods along the White River. Um, so I'm going to, launch us into a conversation about forests and forest management. And I think maybe, for the purposes of the recording that we're doing tonight, maybe if you don't mind, jot your questions down or try to store them, as best you can to memory, and then we'll come back to that at the end. If you've got a burning question, I'm happy to answer it as we go. But I think for the flow, it might be better to do it that way. So yeah, let's jump in. Um, I'll be bugging Chris as we go here. So I wanted to start as Earl did better than I can by acknowledging that I am just a visitor here, and standing trees, we exist to think about what life will be like many generations ahead from now, and in order to create that vision for the future, we look to the past and we try to get through the ecological amnesia that has come over our culture, where we are really kind of listless right now, not knowing where things were and having a really hard time figuring out where we might go. We're kind of stuck in this place, in New England and really across the developed world where we are so distant from the way things were not that long ago, that we don't even realize, looking around us, all of the harm that we have caused. I think Aldo Leopold has that oft quoted remark about being an ecologist is kind of seeing the world of wounds around you, and I think we could all stand to become more ecologically minded and ecologically aware so that we see those wounds. We're not fooled by those greenwashed mountains, not fooled by the amazing, tree canopy of New England into thinking that what we're seeing is a healthy forest. So very grateful to be in this place now, and I take it, very seriously, the obligation to future generations and to honoring, the indigenous community that is still thriving today and hopefully will be thriving even more in the future. So, anyways. So Standing Trees is a new organization. I'm guessing you are all somewhat familiar with Standing Trees, but I wanted to start by saying a little bit about who we are and also who we are not, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. Some of which has made its way to I think the people coordinating tonight's event. Standing Trees came to be over the last 5 years or so. I moved to Vermont in 2018 from the Northern Rockies, where I had been living for about 10 years. I grew up in New England in the Boston area. Went out to school at the University of Montana because wild places and wild things are what I wanted to study, and public lands in particular and how we manage them and take care of them are my passion. And when I moved back to New England with my wife and daughter in 2018, after working in the conservation community out in the western U.S. for about 15 years, I couldn't believe that here in New England, there wasn't an organization advocating for changes in the way that we manage our public lands. That was unbelievable to me. I grew up taking it for granted. I just imagined that all of these big, environmental NGOs in the Northeast were doing that work. When I read the news, I figured it was all about protecting public lands. That was not going on here. And I learned that, moving back here, and it took a few years, but gathered a critical mass of people, some of whom are in this room together, and we created Standing Trees. And it's been an honor and a lot of fun. And we are changing the way forests are managed. And I think in a very short time, we've really, really catapulted the conversation ahead. So what are we not? We are not here to say no logging. That's not what we're about. I have a wood stove at home. I'm sure many of you have a wood stove at home. This is Vermont. I burn cord wood in the winter in part. It's not my sole heating source. I live in a house that is in part made of wood. We are not in denial about the utility of wood products, and that they, are really handy. And, what we are about is being smarter about the way that we make use of our forests. We're making sure that we don't just think about how we're using forests, so that our relationship with them is not just utilitarian, and that we're actually developing a really deep and personal relationship with forests, a reciprocal relationship with forests. And our focus is on public lands and public policy. So we're not here to tell private landowners what to do with their forests, right? And the vast majority of New England, as we'll talk about, is privately owned. Just 9% of New England is in public ownership. And so we're really here to talk about those public lands, first and foremost. That's what Standing Trees is all about. So please go to the next one. So my career started 20 years ago. After graduating high school in the Boston area, I was lucky enough to go to work for the U.S. Forest Service in the Cascades in Washington. And that launched my career. And I, never looked back. It was a transformative summer. I had known even before then that wild places were my calling. As a really as a young person who struggled with mental health issues, wild places were my refuge. And so to me, this work is, it's as personal as it gets. These places changed my life, and I'm spending the rest of my life protecting these places. It's really as simple as that. So everything else that I do that I'm going to talk about tonight, carbon, biodiversity, it's all really important. But the reason I wake up every single morning at 5 a.m. to go to work on this stuff, and the reason I go to bed at midnight, finishing up my work on this stuff, is because it matters to me so deeply personally. And I was so lucky to start my career doing work in amazing wild places in the Cascades. So that gave me a real sense of what wild places are. And I do the work for my daughter and for future generations. And I'm sure many of you have kids or grandkids, and this is making sure that we get to a better place when they're, my age, your age. And her future is uncertain, right? I don't have to tell you all this. This is a slide that I think is required for a presentation of this sort, but it's like stating the obvious. We're living through crazy times. Like Earl said, if it hasn't been dumping rain, it's been smoky. It's been one or the other all summer long. What is wild summer? Not what I came back to New England expecting. And it turns out that our land management decisions, not just climate change, and in fact I would say even more so, it's our land management decisions that have a huge impact, a greater impact on the water quality issues plaguing our rivers and lakes, on the incredible biodiversity that we've lost in Vermont, or that we are on the verge of losing, on the fires. It's we hear climate. Well, guess what? There's going to be interesting research coming out very soon about how those Canadian fires are tearing through some of the most heavily logged forests on the planet. And it's not just some untouched wilderness, as if that existed, right? That is burning up here. It is some of the most industrialized forest lands in the globe that are burning at these unprecedented levels this summer. So, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And, putting our cities in the middle of floodplains doesn't help the situation. So, yeah, go ahead. So this is just making the point again that, are we just blaming climate change because it's kind of easy? Is it just a convenient scapegoat when there are decisions that we're making every single day about how we relate to the land around us that actually have a much greater impact on our experience of this changing climate, right? So climate change, and I wrote about this in an op-ed in Vermont Digger that you may have seen recently, climate change may be responsible for the extra rain that we're experiencing this summer, right? And at least in some respects. But the damage that rain causes is a result of the land use decisions that we've made. If it was just pouring rain on the landscape that was here 400-500 years ago, would there be the damage that so I think it's really important to think about the bigger picture here. And not just blame climate change, because it's to some degree, I think that puts the responsibility off of ourselves. All right, so we're going to dig in, and I'm going to try to move quickly here. There's so many myths and misconceptions that we could talk about. I chose 5, and that I hoped would kind of pick up a lot of the big ones. And so, my hope tonight is to really debunk some of the arguments that you're hearing most often from people in the timber industry or from state and federal land managers, so that you are better prepared with an answer when you are talking to friends about these issues, when you're talking to public land managers about these issues. We'll just scratch the surface today, but we'll get into some good stuff. All right, number one, a conserved forest, quote unquote conserved forest, is a protected forest. What? I feel like I'm in a Mel Brooks movie or something like that. Please go to the next slide. What do I mean by this? So let's talk a little bit about land ownership in New England, and let's dig into the headlines a little bit when you're reading about the land conservation, quote unquote, that's going on. So I'm sorry this is not very clear up here, but this is a map from Wildlands and Woodlands, which is I think one of the best sources of information on and definitely one of the best visions for forest, agricultural land, conservation and management around the region. Starting in 2006, Harvard Forest and the Highstead Foundation put this Wildlands and Woodlands, and now it's called Wildlands and Woodlands, and farms and communities started putting this vision out there. So what you're seeing here is that, again, 9% of New England is in public ownership. The green and the purple, let's see if my... Not finding the laser pointer. But the green are federal public lands. The purple is state public lands. And the light green are, privately owned forest lands. The red is corporate owned timberlands. And so, you get a quick sense that, in New England, that 9% is not spread around evenly. Maine, despite being as large as the rest of New England combined, only 6% of Maine is public land. The vast majority of it is private. About 20% of New Hampshire and Vermont are in public ownership, and considerably less in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So, just to give some context here. Go ahead. And of the lands that are protected, now today, about a quarter of New England, it's pretty significant, is conserved from development, meaning you can't build a Walmart there, you can't build a parking lot. But that doesn't really say a lot about how we're actually managing the land. It's great that you can't put a box store there, but what does that say about what we're doing otherwise on that land? It doesn't say much. And so only 3% out of that, out of this whole landscape, only 3% is protected from logging. That's it. Just 3% of New England. It's the same percentage of Vermont, 3% of Vermont. So all of the conserved land is, the light green on the map here. The dark green are wildlands protected from logging. This is a brand new map from a brand new report, well worth finding, also on the Wildlands and Woodlands website. Wildlands in New England. It's a deep, in-depth report. It's definitely worth checking out. So we get these headlines all the time in Vermont. Biggest patch of unprotected private land in the Green Mountain National Forest to be preserved forever. 6,500 private acres conserved forever for Vermont's future. We're reading headlines like this with some regularity. We have land trusts that are doing good work around the state. And I'm not here to diminish the work that goes into protecting logged forests or agricultural land around the region. But what you will not find in either one of these articles, and I'm intentionally leaving out the organizations that are responsible for these projects and the authors of these articles, because I'm not trying to point fingers at individual organizations right now. But what you will read, if you read their press releases, and then if you read the news stories that come out, is you will not see anything about the logging that is going to happen and continue to happen after these lands are conserved. So that the public perception almost all the time of these major projects is that these are protected. No more logging. It's, we're leaving it alone. It's going to grow old. That is not what happens. Again, 26% of New England is conserved from development, but just 3% is protected from logging. And it's, again, Vermont is not any different from the rest of New England in that respect. So this is a project up in the Worcester Range that happened recently. This was a project that was just completed in the Central Green Mountain National Forest. This land, almost as soon as it comes into public ownership, in this case, by the Green Mountain National Forest, is up on the chopping block in what's called the Telephone Gap Integrated Resource Project. So almost immediately. So if you go to the next slide. This is a project that we are working on right now called the Tarleton Integrated Resource Project. And it's just a short drive away in New Hampshire. Lake Tarleton, Lake Armington, beautiful places. This was an area acquired by the White Mountain National Forest 20 years ago. The local community raised millions of dollars to protect this whole landscape from logging and resort development. And today, the White Mountain National Forest is about to log 700 acres of that landscape against the will of, so many of these people who worked, donated. It's just crazy to me, the disconnect. And the U.S. Forest Service doesn't seem to understand the irony or to, really have the ability to look back in time at what the promises were that were made to the community at the time, where they talked about, logging not being in the plans, et cetera, et cetera. So I share all of this because I want you to be a smart consumer of the news media when it comes to these stories. When the Appalachian Mountain Club, I am naming an organization here, protects 20,000 plus acres in northern Maine, I mean, that's amazing. That's great work by AMC. But it's not like it's all going to just be allowed to grow old. Even though AMC owns it, a lot of that, or the Nature Conservancy, a lot of those lands will continue to be logged long into the future. And the conservation easements that are placed on those lands guarantee that. So I just want to make sure that we're understanding the language of conservation. Okay, now this is a big one. We hear this all the time in arguments for why we need to go in and do more forest management in the Northeast and all up and down the eastern seaboard, up and down the Appalachians. There is an enormous campaign to promote the idea of the importance of young forests. And you'll see this used to rationalize all of the logging projects on the White Mountain and the Green Mountain National Forest. It also goes by the term early successional habitat. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with young forests, early successional habitat. It's critical to, the health of a forest. The question is, how large is the patch size? What is the complexity of that habitat? Does it have any resemblance to the kind of young forest that would have been created here through indigenous burning practices in valley bottoms, like right here in the White River Valley? Does it have any resemblance to what a beaver would create in a wetland? Does it have any resemblance to the vast majority of the early successional habitat that we have naturally in New England, which is from wind throw, right? Wind throw or ice storm damage. And that occurs on an incredibly small scale. We're talking 1/4 of an acre or less is the typical patch size for early successional forest in New England, in northern New England. So what we're seeing here, which is, ostensibly to create that early successional habitat, has no resemblance. What this resembles is a tornado that went through, and then they took all of the biomass away. And that biomass is what would have been the building block of future forest life for invertebrates, for, regrowth. Anyways, you go to the next slide. So where does this idea, this passion for young forests come from? Well, it's amazingly romantic, and it's incredible that, the language that's used by some of the organizations promoting this is really stunning to read. But this is a diorama from Harvard Forest Fisher Museum. If you've never been down there, it's a neat place to visit. They have a diorama display that shows the transformation of the New England landscape over time. And this is an estimate of what the New England landscape would have looked like right around here, not that long ago. And so, as you can imagine, as these agricultural lands were abandoned in the late 1800s and even into the early 1900s, we had an incredible amount of forest regrowth going on, right? I mean, the amount of regenerating forest around northern New England was, I mean, everything was young forest. And so if you go to the next slide, well, I guess I'm skipping around here, but let's go one slide. Okay, we'll go backwards again. Maybe I should have reordered a couple of things here. No, you can go forward. So what you'll see in a second is that there is a very real attempt right now to kind of romanticize and go back to this time when the species that really like this kind of habitat, or the young forests that grow up from this habitat, those organizations, the Ruffed Grouse Society, Wild Turkey Federation, hunting organizations, have really latched on to, again, that romantic idea of New England as it was 200 years ago, 150 years ago, and are really pushing for much more early successional habitat today than would ever have naturally occurred on the landscape. But people remember those days, even in some of our own lifetimes, those days where there was more of that kind of habitat around the Northeast. It wasn't that long ago. But one of the definitive papers on the scale and distribution of early successional habitat, which is widely cited, the Forest Service uses it in its own kind of studies, found that just 1 to 3% of northern hardwood forest was ever in this early successional state. Just 1 to 3% historically. Now, mind you, right, Vermont was 80% deforested or more at the height of, of agriculture, in the state. And so today, we have an amount and extent of early successional habitat that is probably many times what it was historically. There's no shortage of early successional habitat. Does it occur in exactly the same distribution or patch sizes that it did once upon a time? No, it doesn't, because we've lost almost all of that incredible beaver population that kept our rivers and wetlands healthy. And we don't have old enough forests yet to have as much of the wind throw that would actually naturally occur in our forests. So we're still working towards getting exactly where things were in terms of early successional habitat, but there is no shortage of it. The species that inhabit these young forests are not imperiled. They are not endangered. What some people would kind of make into a crisis is that there are some early successional species that are in decline in the Northeast. But that's because the forests are coming back to where they were. You may not know this, but we did not have nearly the population of monarch butterflies in the Northeast that we actually did up until recently, because we didn't have the open habitats here for monarchs. They were a species that was much more predominant in the Midwest, for example. As those agricultural lands, as those prairies were turned into agricultural lands, we got, monarchs actually inhabiting the Northeast in a much different population distribution. So there's a lot of changes afoot and a lot of myths about young forests. And we could talk about this all night, but let's keep going. Today we've gone from 80% deforestation to 76% tree cover in Vermont. But what does that really mean? It's the same thing as what does conserved mean, right? Trees are great. I love trees, but I prefer forests. And we don't have healthy functioning forests yet. So I think the 76% statistic is really easy to kind of misapply or misunderstand. Today, just 0.3% of New England forests are over 150 years old. And those are just the ones that have been lucky enough to keep growing since agricultural abandonment. So anyways, old growth forests like this one, which I was just recently walking through in the Adirondacks, are very few and far between. Less than 0.1% of Vermont is old growth forest, meaning never seen an axe or a saw. But these are the forests that our species evolved within. And, even our Fish and Wildlife staff at Vermont Fish and Wildlife have acknowledged in the Vermont Conservation Design Report that, most of the time, all you need to do to recover these conditions is just step back. Just let the forest grow. That's it. No other manipulation or intervention is necessary. So this is a report by the state of Vermont that acknowledges as much. So I think this is just, so often glossed over. I think I've already talked about this. This is a great study that came out earlier this year, Kellett et al. I can share all of these papers with Chris so that he can circulate them. There's been an incredible advance in studies on forest carbon, biodiversity in the last just 5 years. And so these issues are really coming into focus now. The changes in species over time as our forest cover has changed and the quality of our forests have changed. Anyways, we can keep going. So I mentioned the Rough Grouse Society. I'm just going to talk about this for a moment because it's really important to understanding what's going on in the woods right now on public lands. The Rough Grouse Society, again, the Wild Turkey Federation, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, which is not just a Rocky Mountain organization, they work across the country. They are all entering into what are called master stewardship agreements with the U.S. Forest Service right now and bringing private dollars to pay for the analysis for projects that they want to see completed. So on the Green Mountain National Forest, in 2019, the Early Successional Habitat Creation Project was signed by the district ranger for the Manchester Ranger District. It involves 12,000 acres of even-aged management. Even-aged management means clear cuts, shelter wood cuts, similar to clear cuts, multi-stage clear cuts, large patch cuts, all over the Manchester Ranger District. This project was facilitated with basically a gift of $80,000, $40,000 from the Rough Grouse Society, and then a match from Trust for Wildlife. And if I brought $80,000 to the Forest Service to tell them not to log a forest, do you think I would have much success? No. And I think I'd be labeled, it'd be called bribery, I think is what that would be called. But here, this is happening all the time right now. Up and down the eastern U.S., we've got these organizations that have a, vested interest in that early successional habitat, really driving a lot of the logging that's going on right now. Okay. You hear this a lot too, that old forests are dying, they're decaying, in order to make sure that we are actually absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere and that our forests don't become carbon sources, we need to cut them down and let the young forests grow, right? We hear this all the time. Now, we have better science in just the last several months than we've had in a long time on how bogus this is. So we'll talk about that here. This is a lot of text, I'm sorry. If I have a few slides that are probably too much text. A great study that was just published by Edward Feisen at the Highstead Foundation looked at plots all over the Northeast. And what he and his colleagues found was that the carbon benefits of young forests compared to old have been completely, misstated. And not only that, but the carbon benefits of letting a forest grow older, you don't have to wait around until a forest gets old. You reap the rewards right away. Wild forests are better at absorbing carbon. They're going to accumulate the down woody debris that a lot of our biodiversity relies upon, that our floodwaters are slowed down by. The benefits of leaving a forest alone accrue right away. And we don't have to wait for old growth to actually have, the benefits of leaving a forest alone. This is another excellent paper that I highly encourage you to read, but really does a good job of debunking some of the myths out there. Just to put a spotlight on this, in those places, just 5% of the Northeast U.S. that we have put under management that excludes logging. 5% of the Northeast U.S. is off limits to logging. Most of that's in the Adirondacks, right? 30% of all of the above ground carbon, all of the carbon that's not in the soil, is in just 5% of the forests in the Northeast U.S. That is an incredible statistic. And again, I think speaks to when you leave forests alone, it's that accumulation of carbon over time There's been other incredible studies about the rapid accumulation of carbon, well, not just rapid, but over millennia that occurs since the last glacial period, how much carbon has been accumulating in forests that have not been harvested. So when you take that step back, that's when we're really doing something for the climate. And I think, I grew up in New England. I think, I don't know, I had a tendency to look west. I think a lot of us in the East have a tendency to look west at, those big, incredible, sequoia forests and the coastal, Doug firs and western red cedars that I used to work in Washington State. And, I think we all kind of write off our eastern forests sometimes as being just kind of run of the mill. And that's absolutely not the case. Our eastern forests actually, in total, store more carbon than forests in the western U.S. We have a carbon storage reservoir here in the Northeast that is only second to the Pacific Northwest and the area around the Smokies in the Southeast. And what we are learning, you can go to the next slide, is that there is so much more carbon that can be accumulated if we just leave these forests alone. So what we're seeing today is just a fraction of the amount of carbon that could be stored. On average, in public forests, because they are harvested less intensively, typically, than private lands in New England, 30% more above ground carbon, is found in public forests. So just another sign. And like I was just saying a second ago, Bill Keaton at UVM did a study that shows that we could store 2 to 4 times more carbon on average in our forests here in northern New England by just letting forests grow old. And this is a map of forest carbon storage around New England. And you can see the areas that have had less harvest intensity are where there's the most carbon. So Maine being logged incredibly intensively is where there's the least forest carbon. And it all depends on logging. That's the determining factor. 86% of the carbon that's lost from our forests every year is from timber harvest. Just 3% of the carbon that's lost every year is from deforestation. So you hear mostly in the news about deforestation, which means literally, getting rid of a forest, turning it into a house or, subdivision, strip mall. But from a carbon perspective, it's the logging that's really the culprit. It's not the conversion from forest to other land uses. And the studies that have looked out into the future find the same thing. So this is a study by people at Harvard Forest. Jonathan Thompson is a really amazing researcher who's done a lot of good work over the last decade. And they're finding that again, it's on to the future. It's timber harvest. It's not even with the build out that we're expecting in New England, urban build out is not going to have nearly the impact on carbon in our forests as our forest management decisions, where our forests, are located. So keep going. Okay. Another myth that you hear all the time. We have to cut our forests to make them more resilient to climate change. We have to cut our forests to help them adapt to climate change. We have to cut our forests to, make them more diverse. And of course, we hear this, in every Forest Service proposal that we see these days in the White Mountain and the Green Mountain National Forest. Let's think about for a second, what do they mean when they say in these proposals diversity? What do they mean when they say resilience? So this is a clear cut from the Groton State Forest here in Vermont. And when you hear the Forest Service or State Forest Parks and Recreation talk about forest diversity, you'll hear them talk about age class diversity, so that we need to have, again, more young forest. Again, they are creating that diversity in a scale, 10, 20, 30 acres with some of these cuts that has no resemblance to the diversity that would naturally occur, the habitat diversity that would occur in our forests. So it's like we're speaking 2 different languages here. And so when you see these kind of buzzwords, diversity, resilience, adaptation, what does that really mean? So if you go to the next slide. This is a slide that I've borrowed from my former employer, Northeast Wilderness Trust. that just does a good job of showing the natural diversity that occurs in an older forest. You've got the light streaming in on a very small patch of ground. Again, this is probably a quarter of an acre opening, perhaps at the most, I think. And all of these little niches are created when you've got these tip-ups and when you've got, a couple trees falling over on each other. This is the diversity of a, northern New England old growth forest. This is the kind of opening that you would typically see. When you let forests grow old, when you protect older forests, what you're protecting is the full age range from the oldest to the youngest trees, and you're protecting the greatest tree species diversity. You're protecting of course, the carbon, in that forest, above ground carbon, as well as the soil carbon. And again, Bill Keaton and I think one of his former students, Dominic Tom, put out a great study in 2019 that looks at all of these questions. And then there's another great study that came out just this year from the same authors who wrote a paper that you may have heard about, coining the term proforestation, that also talks about, it's another kind of synthesis that really shows clearly, except for where economic interests are paramount, logging does not help our forests become more adapted, more resilient. So we should think more about, is the kind of even low level of disturbance that goes on in a lightly managed forest, is that actually beneficial? Or should we be concentrating, logging in perhaps, certain areas and then really allowing much larger areas to grow old? And I think these are all really important questions for us to be thinking about right now. And so in Montpelier, obviously we've been dealing with a lot of flooding lately, and the state of Vermont knows full well that this was coming. We had Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Irene, obviously not that long ago, prompting a lot of research into the way that we could improve management of state lands to address flooding. And in 2015, David Brin of Vermont Family Forests and Kristen Underwood put together a report on how to improve state land management to mitigate flooding. And this report never saw the light of day. It has never been cited in any management plan that the state has put out since this time. It was as if there was no desire on the part of the state to, see this come out. We did a public records request to find out, did the state ever look into this when they were developing management plans for the Camel's Hump management area? They just came out with a plan for Camel's Hump a couple of years ago. And what we found was that, yes, they did look at this, and they realized that if they were to implement the recommendations here, they'd have to really cut back on their logging. And so this report does not show up in the bibliography. It's never talked about. You won't find it on any state website, even though the state commissioned it, and it builds from, the state's own understanding of the importance of addressing land management for flood mitigation. So it's amazing, how resistant we've been to some of these changes, but maybe not surprising. And I just want to touch on this. I think Rachel Smoker probably talked a lot about biomass when she was here. I mean, that's her specialty, so I didn't want to go into biomass too much. But one of the things that you'll hear all the time in New England is, how are we going to get rid of that low-grade wood? Low-grade wood is always a topic of conversation in forest management circles. How are we going to, it's wood that doesn't really pay its way out of the forest very well. And this low-grade wood, without a market, apparently, is going to destroy our forests because it'll be left there. And this is the wood that makes its way to our biomass power plants, like Rygate, like McNeil. It's the wood that makes it into your pulp and paper. It's the wood that makes it into increasingly other, uses of low-grade wood. I mean, it could be any number of different things these days. But what I want to be really clear about is that the whole idea of low-grade wood is to me offensive, derogatory, And it smacks to me of just, I mean, I don't know that it's used intentionally in this way. I'm not trying to ascribe intent, but it certainly contributes, I think, to our lack of appreciation for the real diversity of a forest, which includes lots of misshapen trees, lots of dead and dying trees, those snags out there, that down wood, all has an incredible importance for biodiversity, for carbon, you name it. It's not of low value. And, I'll take another step back even a little bit farther to say that forestry has its origins in this country in the eugenics movement. Gifford Pinchot, one of the founders of American forestry, who brought European forestry concepts back to this continent, who was the founder of the Yale Forestry School, still to this day, the preeminent forest management school in this country, where a lot of the policy comes out of. Pinchot was one of the nation's leading eugenicists. And, I think it's be an interesting research project someday for somebody to look into the ways in which the terms that we use for forest management, like vigorous forest growth, straight trees, I mean, you name it. I honestly think that we are still stuck in this mindset of trying to engineer a better forest, just as we were trying at that time to engineer better people. And we know how unjust and misguided, and I don't have the right words, for all of that. But I think it's really important to understand that a lot of these practices came out of that same era. And we should be, again, questioning some of these dominant mindsets about how important is it for us to be in there intervening, messing with, these forests? Why can't we just leave them to be themselves? Go ahead. Okay, last one. How are y'all doing? I'm going a little long here, but hopefully this is helpful. So I want to clear up this term proforestation, because it's a really simple concept that is being turned into a monster by people who don't like the idea. And so let's just do a quick check on the definitions here for a second. So if you go to the next slide. In 2019, the authors I just mentioned, Edward Fison, Susan Mussino, and William Mumma, put out a paper with the term where they coined the term proforestation. Proforestation means letting a forest grow old. That's all there is to it. Since that time, beginning with the Yale School of Forestry and extending to the Society of American Foresters and many other locations in the timber kind of industry and community, there has been one attempt after another to discredit the science, to discredit the scientists themselves on a personal and professional level, and to brand the term proforestation as a political movement. So this is from the SAF website. This is the professional community of American forestry, right? If you're a forester, you often belong to SAF. As with many political movements, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact origins of proforestation, as if this wasn't just, again, a scientific concept. This is the challenge. We need to face it. And so they have fact sheets that they're putting out there with, messages, talking points about how to push back on this. So go to the next slide. Let's figure this out for a second so that we know what this means. Proforestation, allowing existing intact forests to grow old. Reforestation, planting forests where forests previously existed. Afforestation, planting forests on lands that were not previously forested. Bill and Ed and Susan realized that we didn't have a term for letting forests grow old. There was no word for it. I mean, that seems kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? They came up with a new word. It doesn't mean you have to do it in any particular place. It just means proforestation. It's a word for letting forests grow old. The Society of American Foresters has suggested that it's all about protecting all public lands to allow them to grow old. Well, that's interesting because that is actually the position of standing trees. But we're a political advocacy organization. we're not, we're not the scientists doing the research. We're taking the research and we're suggesting that, well, we know some great places to try out proforestation. Maybe we should try it in lands that we all own in common and ought to be producing more public goods than private goods in this climate change era. But the term proforestation is not a movement, and it is not prescribing management in any particular location. It's just a scientific concept. So the next time you hear someone kind of, call that term out and suggest that it's, baloney, now you have a sense of kind of where it comes from, which I think is really important to participating in this conversation. Okay, we're at the end. Last couple slides. So how do we get to old growth? We've got some ideas at Standing Trees. Maybe you've heard about some of them already. We've been busy. We are working with partners across the country to get the Forest Service, with the pressure of the Biden administration, to put out a rule that would prohibit logging of mature and old growth forests on all federal forest lands, especially here in the East. We're trying to reform state land management so that we can't just keep ignoring studies like the one I just showed you. Trying to create some accountability and transparency. Right now there is zero transparency in the way Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation develops their plans for state lands. If you can believe it, they literally make it up every time they create a management plan. There is no guidebook. There's no rules for how they do it. And you couldn't challenge them if you wanted to when they make a decision because there's nothing to hold them to. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to make sure that you all heard about that gondola that's proposed to go from Smuggler's Notch to Stowe. Guess what? That would pass through a state of Vermont natural area. A state of Vermont natural area is the strongest protection that we have for any public lands in the state of Vermont. It's not very strong protection. All that the governor would need to do is hold a public meeting and then change the plan. There's very little teeth to our natural area designation. So we need to make sure that our natural areas actually mean something and that we are allowing, what few areas we're protecting to grow old. And we had a major legislative victory just this last year. Maybe you heard about it with H126, and we're really looking forward to digging in and pushing for changes to the way Vermont manages its landscape with that. And then finally, maybe you heard about this too, but use value appraisal up until just last year did not allow you to leave your forest alone. We were one of the only states in New England that required logging if you were enrolled in use value appraisal. Now, just 30% of people who are eligible for use value appraisal are allowed to not log their forests. So it's incremental progress, but it's the first major changes to UVA since UVA was created. So we are excited that we made this much progress, and we'll keep fighting until every landowner who qualifies for UVA has the choice to leave their lands alone if that's what they choose to do. Okay. So, whether it's the Climate Action Plan, our State Hazard Mitigation Plan, our Lake Champlain TMDL, I didn't even talk about phosphorus reduction. There's so many things we could talk about that old forests do better. But that's the sweet spot, is letting ecosystems grow old. And what would it mean if we took that 9% of New England and let it grow old? Well, it turns out in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, only 2.8% of the timber supply comes from public land. If we protected public land, it would not have a major impact on the timber economy. Here in Vermont, it's about 3.4% that comes from public land. That's it. So, major impact from a climate and biodiversity perspective, small impact on the flow of logs to our mills and the actual wood products that we use. Go ahead. All right. So thank you. And I'll leave you with this wonderful quote by Mary Bird Davis. I won't read it to you all, but she is the author, editor of an amazing book that you should look for. I don't know if it's still in print, but it's called Eastern Old Growth Forest: Prospects for Recovery and Rediscovery. And highly recommend having it in your library. It has many wonderful authors who contributed to it. So thank you so much for joining in for this, and I really look forward to the conversation now.